Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into the world of LLMs. Large language models. You sent in a really interesting excerpt from the book Foundations of Large Language Models. It's by Tong Xiao and Jingbo Zhu. And it seems like LLMs are just everywhere now.
Yeah, they really are.
But, how do they actually work? That's what we're going to figure out today.
Okay, so the cool thing about LLMs is they're not like those older AI models, the ones that were designed for just one specific task.
Right.
These are called foundation models because they're trained on just massive amounts of data to learn these general language abilities first.
So it's kind of like if you were teaching someone the basics of language, and then they could use that to write, I don't know, poems, emails, maybe even code.
Exactly. The book uses this analogy of a giant jigsaw puzzle.
Oh.
But there's no picture on the box.
Oh, wow.
So the LLM has to figure out how all the pieces fit together, and then it reveals that full picture without any instructions. We call that self-supervised learning.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do they go from a jumble of puzzle pieces to understanding and actually using language? The book mentions this two-step process: pre-training and fine-tuning.
Right. Pre-training is that first step. And the model is basically swimming in this sea of text data. It's learning to find patterns and relationships, kind of like figuring out the grammar rules without actually being taught them.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So if you just gave someone a ton of books and said, figure out how language works.
Yeah. And during pre-training, LLMs tackle specific tasks that have kind of interesting names. One is masked language modeling. That's where the model tries to predict missing words in a sentence.
Like a fill-in-the-blanks game, but for a computer.
Exactly. And it also does next sentence prediction. It's trying to figure out if two sentences logically follow each other, and that helps the model understand how ideas flow, like in arguments and stuff.
So it's not just about individual words, but how they connect to form, like meaningful sequences.
Exactly. And then there's causal language modeling. This is where it gets really interesting. The model reads text sequentially, and it tries to predict the very next word. Think about a supercharged autocomplete, like what you see in your email.
Oh, yeah.
Or messaging apps.
Okay, so that's how those autocomplete features get so good at guessing what you're going to type next.
Exactly.
It's like a simplified version of what LLMs are doing.
Right.
Okay, so what about fine-tuning? How does that step work?
So after pre-training, the model has this really broad understanding of language. And fine-tuning is where we kind of narrow its focus. We train it for a specific task, like translation or, writing different kinds of creative content.
So it's like taking someone who's learned the basics of cooking and then teaching them to specialize in, I don't know, Italian cooking.
Perfect analogy.
They already know how to chop, saute, simmer,
Yeah.
But now they're learning the specific techniques and ingredients for that cuisine.
Yeah, fine-tuning is about tailoring those general language skills to a specific purpose.
Okay. Now, the book mentions BERT. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, BERT stands for bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. Kind of a mouthful.
Yeah.
It was a really big deal in the world of LLMs. It showed the power of these pre-trained models for doing well on many different language tasks.
So BERT was kind of a breakthrough, a proof of concept that this approach really worked.
Exactly. And one of the key things about BERT is that it understands the context of a word by looking at the words before and after it, which was a big improvement over older models that could only look in one direction.
Oh, that's really interesting. It's like if you're trying to understand a word in a sentence, you need to consider the words around it, right?
Exactly.
To get the full meaning.
And that's how BERT was able to achieve such great results on tasks like question answering and sentiment analysis.
Now, what about those LLMs that can generate text? Like ChatGPT, for example.
Right.
What makes them different?
Those are called generative LLMs. And they're all about predicting the probability of a sequence of words. And this makes them really good at writing stories, translating languages, even composing music.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
It's incredible to think that these models can be so creative. It's not just following rules, it's actually generating something new.
Exactly.
But how do we actually interact with LLMs?
Right.
How do we tell them what we want them to do?
So that's where prompting comes in. It's basically just giving the LLM a starting point or a set of instructions. Think of it like giving an artist a theme or a musician maybe, a melody. The LLM then uses its knowledge and skills to create something based on that prompt.
So it's like giving the LLM like a nudge in the right direction
Yeah,
and letting its creativity take over from there.
exactly. And how you design the prompt can have a huge impact. You can give it direct instructions like, translate this sentence, or you can ask it questions like, what are the biggest challenges facing the world today?
So the possibilities are really endless.
Pretty much.
It's like having this conversation with the LLM and guiding it towards a particular outcome.
Yeah.
Speaking of conversations, the book mentions in-context learning. What's that about?
That's one of the most fascinating things about LLMs. In-context learning means they can actually learn from examples. But the examples are given within the prompt itself, so it's as if they're learning by watching a demonstration.
It's like showing someone how to do something instead of just telling them.
Exactly. And researchers are still trying to figure out exactly how LLMs do this. It's kind of a mystery, but it's one of the things that makes these models so powerful and adaptable.
It sounds like LLMs are constantly learning and evolving, which is both, exciting and a little bit daunting. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's talk about prompt engineering, crafting effective prompts, because the book makes it sound like there's a real art to getting the best results from LLMs.
Oh, absolutely. It's like learning to speak the LLM's language.
Oh.
And one of the most important things is clarity. The clearer your instructions, the better the LLM is going to understand what you want.
So it's not enough to just give it a vague idea.
Right. You need to be really precise.
Okay, so it's also important to provide context.
Yes. The more relevant background information you give it, the more nuanced the output is going to be.
So, like, setting the stage for the LLM to perform at its best. The book also mentions this idea of chain of thought prompting. What is that all about?
So chain of thought prompting, it encourages the LLM to think step by step. Especially for complex tasks, it's like you're asking the LLM to show its work so we can understand its reasoning.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just about getting the right answer, it's about understanding how it got there.
Exactly. It's about understanding how LLMs think and learn, and it helps to improve the accuracy of their responses, especially for tasks that require complex reasoning.
This is all incredibly fascinating. But I'm thinking about how LLMs handle really long pieces of text, like summarizing a whole book or analyzing code with thousands of lines. That seems incredibly challenging, even for a super smart AI.
It is. That brings us to long sequence modeling. And you're right, it's a major challenge. Those standard techniques we've talked about, like self-attention and transformers,
Yeah.
they can get kind of bogged down when dealing with those really long sequences of text, like trying to juggle too many balls at once. Things start to get messy.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
So what are researchers doing to help LLMs handle those really long pieces of text? Or are they coming up with entirely new approaches?
They are getting creative. There's a whole range of solutions they're exploring. Some of them are focused on making LLMs more efficient, like how they store and access information, while others are developing new attention mechanisms that are specifically designed for long sequences.
It sounds like they're having to really push the boundaries of what's possible.
Absolutely, and it's really exciting to see what they come up with. It feels like we're just scratching the surface of what LLMs are capable of. But I think it's time we take a little break and come back to this.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
And I'm already starting to see how these LLMs are more than just hype. There's some serious science and engineering going on here.
Yeah.
And I'm really eager to learn more about these advanced techniques. For making LLMs work with longer pieces of text, it sounds like there's a lot more to uncover.
There is. Welcome back. It's great to continue exploring LLMs with you.
I'm ready to dive back in. Before the break, we were talking about the challenges of long sequence modeling. What are some of the techniques researchers are using to tackle this? It sounds like it requires some serious out-of-the-box thinking.
It does. One approach that's gaining traction is using sparse attention mechanisms. Remember we talked about attention being how LLMs focus on the most important parts of the text?
Yeah, like shining a spotlight on certain words and phrases.
Exactly. Well, sparse attention takes this idea a step further. Instead of paying attention to every word in a long sequence, the model focuses on a smaller subset, the ones that are deemed most important. And this makes it way more efficient to process those longer texts.
So like filtering out the noise and just focusing on the important parts.
Right. But like with anything, there are trade-offs. If the model needs to look at something that's outside its current window of attention, then it becomes less efficient.
So it's like if you're reading a mystery novel
Yeah.
and you need to remember a clue from a chapter you read ages ago.
Yeah, good analogy. And that's why researchers are also exploring other techniques, like hierarchical attention. That takes inspiration from how humans organize language, into different levels.
Okay.
Think about a book.
Right.
It's made up of chapters, right? Those chapters have paragraphs, and then sentences and so on.
So with hierarchical attention, the LLM is analyzing text on all these different levels, like creating an outline.
Exactly. And this can be really powerful for this long sequence modeling because it allows the model to, like, zoom in and out, focus on the most important details at each level without getting bogged down by the whole thing.
Okay, so we've talked about sparse attention. We talked about hierarchical attention. What other tricks do researchers have? The book mentions memory models. What are those all about?
Memory models are really fascinating. They're inspired by how our brains store information. It's like giving the LLM a notepad to write down important facts and ideas as it's processing the text.
So the LLM can store important information in its memory as it's going, and then it can access that information later, kind of like a cheat sheet.
That's a good way to think about it. This remembering is really helpful when you're dealing with these super long sequences.
It's like if you were trying to summarize a long article, you might highlight things or take notes.
Right. Memory models give LLMs a similar ability.
Okay, this all makes me realize something else. Even figuring out the position of a word is different when you have thousands of words.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as just saying, like, this is the fifth word in the sentence. Are researchers having to rethink that too? How to represent word positions?
Oh, you're right. The standard way where each word gets a number for its position.
Yeah.
That doesn't work as well with longer sequences, like trying to remember 1,000 different phone numbers. It's just too much.
Way too much.
So, researchers have come up with new ways to represent positions. One way is relative position embeddings.
Okay, how do those work? What makes them different?
Instead of giving an absolute position to each word, relative position embeddings just focus on the distances between words. So instead of this is word number 500, it's like this word is 10 words away from that word.
So, like giving directions by saying, go 2 blocks north, then turn left, instead of go to 1283 Main Street. It's more about relationships, not exact positions.
Exactly. And this helps LLMs understand connections between words, even in those long sequences.
So is it better to pre-train an LLM on long sequences right from the start?
Yeah.
Or is it better to adapt one that was trained on shorter texts?
That's a great question. And there are definitely pros and cons to both approaches. Pre-training on long sequences can give it a head start, but it can also be a huge drain on resources.
It's like that trade-off between time and resources, and then the LLM's ability to handle those long sequences.
Right. The best approach really depends on the situation and the computing power you have available.
It's like deciding whether to build a house from scratch or renovate an existing one.
Yeah.
Both have their pros and cons. Speaking of challenges, how do we even know how well an LLM is doing on these long sequence tasks? Are the traditional ways of measuring still useful?
That's another big question. And honestly, the answer isn't that simple. Traditional metrics, like measuring how well the model predicts the next word in a sequence, those might not be the best way to assess an LLM when it comes to long stretches of text.
So we need new ways to measure how well they're really understanding these longer pieces. What are researchers doing about that?
They're coming up with more sophisticated methods that go beyond just predicting the next word. Things like giving them a long document to summarize, or asking them questions that require them to connect different parts of a text.
So it's about challenging them with tasks that really test their ability to work with these long sequences.
Exactly. And this is helping researchers understand just how well LLMs are grasping the meaning and the context of these longer, more complex texts.
This whole area of long sequence modeling is really fascinating. It's amazing to see how researchers are solving these problems. But I think we should shift gears a bit now, talk about something else important. Alignment. What exactly does that mean in the context of LLMs?
Alignment is all about making sure these powerful LLMs are behaving the way we want them to, aligning with human values. We want to make sure they're creating content that's safe, unbiased, and helpful.
Right. It's like making sure that a really powerful tool is used for good, not for bad.
Exactly. And it's an area that's getting a lot of attention. The book talks about a couple of key approaches. I think it's worth discussing those in detail.
Yeah, let's hear it. So before the break, we were starting to talk about this idea of alignment, making sure these powerful LLMs are used responsibly. And there were those key approaches mentioned in the book. I'm really curious to dig into those a bit more.
Sure. One approach that's used a lot is called supervised fine-tuning. It involves training the LLM, but this time we're using data that reflects the behaviors that we want to see. It's like giving it a set of guidelines, a code of conduct to follow.
Oh, okay. So we're showing it examples of what we consider right and wrong, and then hoping it'll learn to make the right choices. But how do we know that it's actually picking up on those guidelines? Like, how do we ensure that's reflected in what it produces?
Well, that's where learning from human feedback comes in. This takes the alignment idea even further, because now we're bringing in human judgment directly into how the LLM is trained.
So we're not just setting the rules. We're also getting feedback on how well those rules are being followed. Kind of like having a teacher who can give personalized guidance.
That's a great way to put it. One really popular method for this is reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF.
RLHF, that sounds familiar. It's, does it have to do with reinforcement learning? Like where the AI learns by trying things out and seeing what works?
It does. The book makes a really great analogy here. It's like training a dog. You reward the dog for doing good things, discourage the bad behavior, and eventually the dog figures out how to act in a way that pleases you.
Oh, I like that. So with RLHF, we're rewarding the LLM for like creating outputs that we like, the ones that match our preferences. And then we penalize it for the ones that don't. It's like giving the LLM a treat for good behavior or a timeout for the bad stuff.
Exactly. This whole process helps the LLM learn. It figures out which outputs are desirable and which ones aren't. It's how we nudge it towards the behavior that aligns with our values.
This whole concept of alignment is really fascinating. It's almost like we're trying to teach these LLMs right from wrong, give them a sense of ethics. But how do we know that these models, which are, basically math, really understand human values? All those subtle things about ethics.
You're right. It is a complex challenge, and it's something researchers are really focused on. One way to do this is to make the feedback more nuanced. We need to move beyond just saying good and bad.
Oh, okay. So it's not just good output or bad output.
Yeah.
We're giving more detailed feedback that explains why something is good or bad.
Exactly. And this can help the LLM develop a deeper understanding of what we value and what we prefer.
It's like we're giving the LLM a better moral compass. We're not just saying do this or don't do that. We're helping it understand the why behind those rules.
Exactly. And as this research continues, we can hopefully create LLMs that are not just smart, but that are also aligned with, well, the best of what humanity has to offer.
That's a great goal. Speaking of pushing the boundaries, let's circle back to long sequence modeling. It seems like as LLMs get more advanced, they're being asked to work with even longer and more complex texts. It's a challenge that just keeps evolving.
It really does. Imagine an LLM that can summarize an entire research paper or translate a book, but with all the subtle nuances of the language, or, analyze thousands of lines of code looking for tiny errors. These are the kinds of things researchers are working towards.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. But what are the challenges there? What are researchers struggling with?
One big challenge is those standard transformer architectures. They're really powerful, but they also use a lot of computing power when you get to these very long sequences.
So it's like running a marathon with a backpack full of rocks. The further you go, the harder it gets.
Yeah. So researchers are looking for ways to make things more efficient without losing accuracy.
So it's like designing a race car that's both fast and fuel efficient. You need to find that balance.
Perfect analogy. One approach that's showing promise is using sparse attention. We talked about that before. It's basically letting the LLM focus on the most important parts of a long text, like skimming a document to find the main points.
Oh, right. So it's like having a super fast reader who knows exactly what to look for.
That's a good way to think about it.
Right.
And that can really cut down on the amount of computing power needed. It makes it much faster to process those longer texts.
But what about missing important details? If the LLM is just skimming, what if it misses something crucial?
That's a really good point. And it's why they're also looking at techniques like hierarchical attention. This is where the LLM analyzes the text on different levels, like creating an outline, with main points and subpoints.
Right.
That way, it can capture both the big picture and the smaller details without getting overwhelmed by the whole thing.
So it's like having a map with different zoom levels. You can zoom out to see the whole area, and then you can zoom in to see individual streets and buildings.
Exactly. And this is really helpful for things like summarizing documents, where the LLM needs to understand the main ideas, but also those smaller points.
It's like writing the executive summary of a report. You're trying to capture the essence of the whole thing without getting lost in all the specifics.
Right. And then there's also the development of memory models. Remember we talked about giving LLMs a notepad to jot down key facts and ideas.
Yeah, like giving them a way to remember things.
Well, those memory models are becoming even more advanced. Now researchers are looking at different types of memory, like long-term memory and short-term memory. It's all based on how our brains work.
Oh, wow. So now the LLM can store and retrieve information in more complex ways. It's not just a simple notepad anymore. It's more like a whole library.
That's a great way to visualize it. And these memory models are really helping with tasks that require a lot of reasoning, especially when working with these long stretches of text.
It's like solving a big puzzle. You need to remember different pieces of information to figure out how they all fit together.
Exactly. And as these models continue to improve, they're going to become even more important for handling complex real-world tasks, the ones that involve huge amounts of text.
It really does feel like there's so many possibilities. But are there limitations? Are there some things that even with all this research, LLMs are just not going to be good at?
That's a great question. And it's something researchers are still working on. LLMs have come a long way, but they're still fundamentally statistical models. They learn by finding patterns in the data they're given. But it's not the same as how humans understand language.
So there's still a difference in how they process language and how we experience it.
Right. And that means we need to keep doing research, keep pushing the boundaries, but also be aware of their limitations.
It's like we're explorers in this huge uncharted territory. We're making these amazing discoveries.
Yeah.
But we need to be careful. Be aware of the potential dangers and the challenges ahead.
I completely agree. And I think that's what makes this field so exciting, this combination of exploration and cautious optimism.
Well, this has been an amazing journey. We've learned so much about LLMs, from the basic ideas to the latest techniques, like how they handle long sequences and how we can align them with our values.
I hope our listeners now have a good understanding of how these models work, what their potential is, but also some of the challenges we need to solve.
It feels like we put together that big jigsaw puzzle. We've got a clear picture of this whole world of LLMs.
And even though there might be a few pieces still missing, you now have what you need to explore this world further, maybe even help shape its future.
To everyone listening, we encourage you to dive deeper into this world of LLMs. Ask questions, experiment, be a part of this whole adventure of discovery. We don't know what amazing innovations are just around the corner. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.